How one woman's refusal to look away saved a life and revealed that family can be the deadliest enemy. The handwritten note was tucked beneath a crystal paperweight on the mahogany desk in the library, a room that smelled of old leather and expensive whiskey. Grace Mitchell had been cleaning the Ashford estate for 3 years, and she'd learned to notice when things were out of place. This was out of place. The paper was expensive, the kind rich people used for important correspondence. The handwriting was shaky, unlike the confident script she'd seen on birthday cards and business letters scattered throughout the house. And it started with 2 words that made her blood run cold. "I'm sorry." Grace's hands trembled as she read further. By the 3rd paragraph, she was reaching for her phone. By the 5th, she was running through the mansion's corridors, shouting a name she'd only ever spoken in respectful whispers. What she discovered in the next 17 minutes would save a life, expose a conspiracy, and prove that sometimes the people we pay the least attention to are the ones who see us most clearly. But to understand how a housekeeper became the only thing standing between a billionaire and death, you need to know about the woman who refused to be invisible, and the man who'd become invisible to himself. Grace Mitchell was 52 years old, had been cleaning houses in Connecticut's wealthy enclaves for 27 years, and possessed a superpower that most people overlooked. She paid attention, not just to baseboards and ceiling corners, and the specific way Mrs. Vanderbilt liked her. Throw pillows arranged. She paid attention to the things people left behind, the prescription bottles that multiplied in bathroom cabinets, the family photos that slowly disappeared from mantels, the thank you notes that stopped coming, the voices that grew quieter in phone conversations. She'd grown up in Hartford, the youngest of 5 children raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs. Grace had learned early that survival meant reading rooms, understanding moods, anticipating needs before they were spoken. By the time she was 8, she could tell which bill collectors her mother could negotiate with and which ones required immediate hiding. That skill, the ability to see patterns, to notice what others missed, had served her well in the cleaning business. While other housekeepers focused solely on surfaces, Grace understood that wealthy people hired help, not just to clean their homes, but to maintain the illusion that their lives were orderly, controlled, perfect. She'd been married once, briefly, in her 20s. He'd left when their daughter Emma was 2, leaving Grace with a baby, a high school diploma, and a fierce determination that her child would have better options than she'd had. Emma was now 30 years old, a registered nurse at Hartford Hospital, with 2 children of her own. Grace had put her through nursing school cleaning, 15 houses a week, working every holiday, accepting every extra job. She'd attended every graduation, every recital, every hospital shift where Emma received recognition. Sitting in the back, always in the back, proud, but never presuming to take credit. The Ashford estate had become her primary client 3 years ago, after the previous housekeeper retired. The job paid well, $800 per week for 3 days of work, and came with something rare: respect. Mr. Ashford, unlike many of her wealthy clients, actually acknowledged her presence, learned her name, asked about her daughter. Small things. But when you'd spent decades being treated as human furniture, small things mattered. Richard Ashford was 67 years old and worth approximately $2.8 billion, accumulated through a lifetime of shrewd real estate investments, technology ventures, and the kind of business acumen that turned modest opportunities into empires. He'd built his fortune from almost nothing, the son of a middle-class insurance salesman from New Haven. He'd put himself through Yale on scholarships and student loans, started his first real estate company at 26 with $15,000 borrowed from his father's life insurance payout, and spent 40 years building an empire that included commercial properties in 17 states, residential developments, and early investments in tech companies that had appreciated 10,000-fold. Forbes had profiled him in 1998. The Connecticut Contrarian, how Richard Ashford built an empire by betting against the crowd. The article detailed his unconventional strategies, buying properties everyone else considered worthless, investing in technologies others dismissed, seeing value where others saw only risk. He'd married his college sweetheart, Patricia, in 1982. They'd had 3 children: Marcus, now 41, Victoria, 38, and Christopher, 35. The family had lived in the Ashford estate, a 12,000-square-foot mansion in Fairfield County, since 1991, when Richard's success had finally afforded the kind of generational wealth he'd never imagined as a scholarship kid. But wealth, Richard had learned, came with complications money couldn't solve. Patricia had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed at stage 4, gone within 11 months. Her death had gutted him in ways he hadn't anticipated. They'd been married 36 years. She'd been his partner through every risk, every failure, every triumph. Without her, the mansion felt like a museum of memories he could barely stand to inhabit. His children had their own lives, their own families, their own concerns. Marcus ran the West Coast division of Ashford Properties from San Francisco. Victoria managed a venture capital fund in New York. Christopher oversaw the East Coast operations from Boston. They visited occasionally, called on birthdays and holidays. But Richard could feel the distance growing, not just physical miles, but something deeper. Conversations felt transactional. Visits felt obligatory. And lately, there'd been tension he couldn't quite name. At 67, Richard Ashford had everything money could buy, and almost nothing that made life worth living. Grace had noticed the changes starting in July, 3 months before she'd find the note. First, it was small things. Mr. Ashford skipping breakfast, which he'd never done before. The coffee maker unused when she arrived at 8 a.m., the morning newspaper still in its plastic sleeve on the doorstep. Then, bigger things. Entire days where he never left his bedroom. Bottles of prescription sleep aids multiplying in the master bathroom. The daily walks around the estate gardens that he'd maintained religiously. Gone. Stopped without explanation. Grace had tried to express concern carefully. "Mr. Ashford, are you feeling all right? I noticed you haven't been eating much." "I'm fine, Grace. Thank you for asking." But he wasn't fine. She could see it in his eyes. The particular kind of emptiness that came not from temporary sadness, but from fundamental hopelessness. She'd seen that look before. Her Uncle Raymond had worn it for 6 months before he'd walked into his garage, closed the door, and started his car. She'd been 16. Nobody had noticed the signs until it was too late. Grace had promised herself she'd never miss those signs again. But what Grace didn't know, what Richard himself barely understood, was that his despair wasn't organic. It was being deliberately cultivated by the people who were supposed to love him most. While Richard spiraled into depression in Connecticut, his 3 children had been having increasingly urgent conversations about their inheritance. The first meeting had occurred 6 months ago in Marcus's San Francisco penthouse. Victoria had flown in from New York, Christopher from Boston. The ostensible reason was to discuss Dad's well-being. The actual agenda was far more calculated. "He's got $2.8 billion, Victoria had said, pouring herself a 3rd glass of wine. "And we get nothing until he dies. Do you know what our tax exposure is going to be if he lives another 20 years? The estate tax implications alone." "He's our father," Christopher had interrupted, though his tone suggested his objection was more procedural than moral. "He's 67 years old, grieving, and increasingly isolated," Marcus had countered. "We're not being cruel. We're being realistic. He's depressed. He's not managing the business properly. His decision-making has been erratic since Mom died. Maybe it's time to consider." "Consider what?" Christopher asked. Marcus had chosen his words carefully. encouraging him to transfer assets now, estate planning, succession strategies, maybe even suggesting he might be happier stepping back completely, given his mental state. What had started as estate planning discussions had evolved, over subsequent meetings, into something darker. They'd hired a lawyer, not the family's regular attorney, but someone discreet, to explore options, living trusts, conservatorships, competency evaluations, medical power of attorney. And they'd begun a systematic campaign to isolate their father further, to deepen his depression, to make him feel so hopeless that he might consider signing over control of his empire, or, in their darkest calculations, that nature might take its course sooner rather than later. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became more strained. Conversations focused on business problems, financial concerns, challenges that made Richard feel increasingly inadequate as a steward of his own empire. Victoria had started planting seeds of doubt. "Dad, I'm worried about you. You seem so disconnected lately. Have you considered seeing someone? A therapist? Maybe even getting evaluated, just to make sure everything's okay cognitively?" Christopher had pushed financial anxiety. "The market's volatile, Dad. Some of your positions are concerning. Maybe it's time to bring in professional management. You've earned retirement. Why carry this stress?" Marcus had deployed the cruelest weapon. "Mom wouldn't want to see you like this. She'd want you to be happy. Maybe it's time to let go." None of them had explicitly wished their father dead, but they'd created conditions where death might seem, to Richard, like a relief from overwhelming despair. They'd told themselves they were helping, encouraging him to rest, to step back, to consider his legacy. They'd convinced themselves that their concern was genuine, even as they calculated how quickly assets could be liquidated and distributed after his passing. And Richard, grieving and isolated, had internalized their message. He was failing. He was inadequate. He was a burden. The world would be better off without him. Grace arrived at the Ashford estate at 8 a.m. on Tuesday, October 15th, letting herself in with the key she'd been given 3 years ago. The house was silent, too silent. Usually, she could hear Mr. Ashford moving around upstairs, or the sound of television news from his study, or at minimum the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Today, nothing. She began her usual routine, kitchen first, then the downstairs common areas, saving the upstairs bedrooms for later. But something felt wrong. Not tangibly wrong. Nothing was broken or out of place, but atmospherically wrong. The air felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm. At 9:30 a.m., Grace made her way upstairs with her cleaning supplies. Mr. Ashford's bedroom door was closed, which wasn't unusual. She knocked softly, waited for response, heard nothing. She cleaned the guest bedrooms first, the bathrooms, the hallway. At 10:45 a.m., she approached the library, Mr. Ashford's private sanctuary, the room where he spent hours reading, working, or simply sitting in his leather chair, staring at photographs of his late wife. The door was slightly ajar. Grace knocked. "Mr. Ashford? I'm going to clean the library if that's all right." No response. She pushed the door open slowly and saw the note immediately. It was positioned deliberately on the desk, weighted with the crystal paperweight, impossible to miss. Her first instinct was that it was a business letter, something confidential she shouldn't read, but something, that same instinct that had kept her family alive through poverty, that had allowed her to anticipate needs and avoid dangers, made her step closer. The handwriting caught her attention first. Shaky. Wrong. Not Mr. Ashford's usual confident script. And then she read the opening. "I'm sorry." Grace's hands shook as she picked up the paper. Every instinct screamed that she was violating privacy, that she should put it down, that this wasn't her business. but the first two words overrode every other consideration. She read, "I'm sorry. To whoever finds this, probably Grace, who's been kinder to me in the past 3 years than my own children have been in the past 3. I apologize for the trouble this will cause you. I've left instructions with my attorney to ensure you receive compensation for having to deal with the aftermath. You didn't deserve to be put in this position. To my children, I know you've been concerned about my state of mind. You were right to be concerned. I've become a burden to you, a problem to be managed, a complication in your otherwise successful lives. I've heard it in your voices, seen it in your visits that grow shorter and less frequent. You'll be relieved to know this particular problem is resolving itself. I've spent 40 years building something I thought mattered. But what's the point of an empire with no one to share it with? Patricia understood that. She understood me. Without her, I'm just a wealthy old man occupying space in a house too large for one person. I've made arrangements. My attorney has the updated will. The business assets will be liquidated and distributed according to my wishes. The house will be sold. Grace, you'll find you've been provided for more generously than you might expect. Consider it. Thanks for being the only person who treated me like a human being instead of an asset to be managed. I'm not doing this impulsively. I've thought about it for months. Every morning, I wake up and search for a reason to continue, and I can't find one. When living requires that much effort for so little purpose, it's time to stop. I'm tired. I'm ready. And I'm sorry for whatever pain this causes, though I suspect that pain will be brief and more financial than emotional. Please don't blame yourselves. This is my choice. My final choice. The only thing left that's truly mine. Richard Ashford, October 15th, 2024. Grace read the note 3 times, her mind racing through implications and possibilities, and the crushing weight of holding someone's life in her hands. Where was he? The note was here, fresh ink, today's date, which meant she dropped the note and ran. Grace sprinted through the mansion, shouting, "Mr. Ashford! Mr. Ashford!" at a volume that would have mortified her under any other circumstances. His bedroom, empty. Bathroom, empty. Home office, empty. She ran downstairs. Living room, dining room, kitchen, all empty. Then she remembered. The garage, her Uncle Raymond, closed garage, running car, carbon monoxide. Grace burst through the door connecting the kitchen to the 3-car garage and saw it immediately. Richard's Mercedes, engine running, garage door closed. Through the driver's side window, she could see his silhouette, head back against the headrest, eyes closed, still. She didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed her. She acted. Grace ran to the garage door opener, slammed the button. The door began its slow mechanical ascent, fresh air rushing in. She yanked open the driver's side door of the Mercedes, reached across Richard's body, and turned off the ignition. "Mr. Ashford! Richard! Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered. Conscious. Still alive. "Stay with me. I'm calling 911. Stay with me." She dialed with shaking fingers, gave the address, explained the situation. Carbon monoxide exposure, suicide attempt, patient conscious but disoriented. While she waited for the ambulance, Grace did something that surprised her. She held Richard Ashford's hand. "You're going to be okay," she said. "I've got you. You're not alone." His eyes focused on her face. Recognition flickered. "Grace?" His voice was weak, confused. "Why?" "Because you matter," she said simply. "Because your life has value beyond your bank account. Because someone needs to see you, really see you. And right now, that someone is me." The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Paramedics assessed Richard quickly. Elevated carbon monoxide levels, but not yet critical, thanks to Grace's intervention. They loaded him onto a stretcher administered oxygen, prepared for transport. One paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, touched Grace's shoulder. You saved his life, another 10, 15 minutes, and we'd be looking at a very different outcome. Grace nodded, numb with adrenaline and shock. As they loaded Richard into the ambulance, he reached for her hand one more time. "The note," he whispered. "Please, don't let them see it yet. Not until I can explain." Grace understood. He didn't want his children finding out about the suicide attempt before he had a chance to understand why he'd survived it. "I'll take care of it," she promised. But Grace had no idea that keeping that promise would lead her to uncover a conspiracy that would shatter the Ashford family and expose just how far people will go for money. Richard Ashford spent 3 days in Hartford Hospital under psychiatric observation. The carbon monoxide exposure had been moderate, not severe enough to cause lasting physical damage, but enough to require monitoring. The bigger concern was his mental state. Grace visited every day after finishing her other cleaning jobs. She brought books from his library, downloaded audiobooks onto her phone for him to listen to, and simply sat with him when he didn't want to talk. On the second day, Richard asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Why did you save me?" Grace considered her answer carefully. "Because I've seen what happens when nobody does, and because that note said you thought nobody cared about you as a person. I wanted you to be wrong about that. You barely know me. I know you tip generously at Christmas. I know you always ask about Emma and remember her children's names. I know you say, 'Please' and 'thank you' to people most rich folks treat like furniture. I know you sit in your library looking at pictures of your wife and crying when you think nobody's watching." Grace leaned forward. "I know more than you think, and what I know is that you're in pain. But pain isn't permanent unless you make it permanent." Richard's eyes welled with tears. "My children haven't been called yet, have they? I asked the hospital not to contact them until I was ready." "Why?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Because I don't know if they'd come, and I don't know which answer would be worse, them not coming at all or them coming out of obligation." Grace made a decision. "Mr. Ashford, Richard, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me without getting defensive." She told him about the patterns she'd noticed over the past 3 months, the way his children's phone calls had shifted in tone, the way visits had become increasingly strained and focused on business concerns, the way they'd started questioning his competence, his decisions, his mental clarity. "I'm a housekeeper," Grace said, "but I'm not deaf, and I'm not stupid. I've been in this house when your kids visited. I've heard things." "What things?" Grace hesitated, then decided truth was kinder than protection. "Victoria asking if you'd considered getting cognitively evaluated. Marcus talking about bringing in professional management for your company. Christopher suggesting you might be happier stepping back from the business. All of them, every visit, making you feel like you're failing." Richard's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something darker. "They're worried about the inheritance," Grace continued. "I don't know all the details, but I know what financial desperation looks like in people who think they're entitled to something. I've seen it before in families I've worked for." "You think my children were, what, trying to convince me to sign over my assets?" "I think they were creating conditions where you might feel you had no choice. I think they were isolating you, undermining your confidence, making you feel inadequate. I think they wanted you dependent, vulnerable, and willing to transfer control." That's a serious accusation. It's a serious pattern, and you should know. I kept your note. I read it. And what it described, that's not organic depression, Richard. That's manufactured hopelessness. Richard was discharged from the hospital on October 18th with prescriptions for antidepressants, a referral to a psychiatrist, and instructions for follow-up care. Grace drove him home in his Mercedes, the same car he'd almost died in 3 days earlier. As they pulled into the estate's circular driveway, Richard said, "I want to know the truth. If you're right about my children, I need proof. And if I'm wrong, then I'll apologize for doubting them and work on rebuilding our relationship through therapy. But if you're right," his voice hardened, "then I need to know exactly what they've been planning." Grace thought about it. "I'm a housekeeper, not a detective." "No, but you notice things. You see patterns. And you're in my house 3 days a week when I'm not paying attention to details." Richard turned to face her. "Grace, I'm asking you to help me. Pay attention to things you might have dismissed before. Check the house for anything unusual. Help me understand what's been happening. You want me to spy on your family. I want you to help me see clearly. Depression clouds judgment, but maybe my depression was being cultivated. If that's true, I need to know." Grace agreed, though every instinct told her this was dangerous territory. But she'd saved his life. Seemed wasteful to let someone else's machinations destroy it afterward. 2 days after Richard returned home, Grace was cleaning the master bathroom when she noticed something odd about his prescription bottles. There were 7 different medications: sleep aids, anti-anxiety medication, antidepressants from his previous doctor. She knew Richard had been taking sleeping pills occasionally, but 7 different prescriptions, all filled within the past 2 months. She photographed the labels with her phone, and during her lunch break, called her daughter Emma. "Can you look up some medications for me? I want to know what they do, and if they interact." Emma, accustomed to her mother's occasional medical questions about elderly clients, researched the list. She called back 20 minutes later, her voice concerned. "Mom, this medication combination is dangerous. 3 of these are sedatives. 2 are antidepressants that can cause extreme drowsiness when combined with the other medications. The sleep aid he's on is incredibly powerful. And there are interaction warnings between at least 4 of these drugs. Would a doctor prescribe all of these at once? Not competently. This looks like someone doctor shopping, going to multiple physicians to get different prescriptions that wouldn't be approved if one doctor saw the full picture." Grace felt ice in her stomach. What would this combination do to someone? Extreme fatigue, depression, cognitive fog, hopelessness. Basically, it would make someone feel like they're losing their mind while being too exhausted to fight back. How would someone get multiple prescriptions without raising red flags? If someone had medical power of attorney or was listed as a healthcare proxy, they could take the patient to different doctors, present different symptoms, get separate prescriptions. The patient might not even realize what they're taking if the pills are distributed by the proxy. Richard didn't have medical power of attorney assigned to anyone. Grace had seen his estate documents when organizing his office. He'd been meticulous about not signing over any control after Patricia died. But someone had access to multiple doctors. Someone had been filling these prescriptions. Someone had been giving Richard medication combinations designed to deepen his depression. Grace checked the pharmacy labels. 3 different pharmacies across 2 states, Connecticut and New York. The prescriptions had been filled by someone named Victoria Ashford, picking up for patient Richard Ashford. Grace had never snooped through Richard's personal papers. Her job was to clean, not to investigate. But Richard had given her explicit permission to look for anything unusual, so she started with his home office. Richard kept meticulous records, file cabinets organized by year, labeled clearly, everything documented. Grace started with the most recent files, 2024. What she found made her hands shake. There were multiple documents Richard had been asked to sign over the past 6 months. Documents presented by his children during their visits, often with urgent explanations about tax planning or estate protection. Grace couldn't understand all the legal language, but she understood enough. a living trust revision that would have transferred operational control of Ashford properties to a board consisting of his 3 children, a medical power of attorney granting Victoria decision-making authority over his health care, a revised will that accelerated distribution timelines and reduced trustee oversight, a competency evaluation request that would have required Richard to undergo psychological testing to maintain control of his assets. Most damning, Richard had refused to sign any of these documents. His notes, scrawled in margins, showed his resistance. Too rushed. Need time to review. Why the urgency? This doesn't feel right. Postpone until I can consult independent counsel. But the documents kept coming back, visit after visit, with increasing pressure and increasingly dire explanations for why they needed to be signed now. Grace photographed everything. On her 3rd day of investigation, Grace found something that changed everything. Richard had a home security system, cameras covering the exterior of the property, and motion sensors inside. But he also had a newer system in his study, a voice-activated recording device he'd used for dictating business notes. The device kept recordings for 90 days before auto-deleting. Grace, with Richard's permission, accessed the files. Most were mundane. Richard, dictating reminders, making notes about property investments, recording thoughts about business decisions. But one recording from September 15th, exactly 1 month before his suicide attempt, was different. It had captured a conversation in the study between Richard's 3 children. Richard had been upstairs resting, and his children had apparently assumed the house was empty except for them. Grace listened with growing horror. He's still refusing to sign the living trust revision. We've presented it 3 times. We need him to sign before he gets clarity. The medications should be making him more pliable. Are you sure they're working? He seems more stubborn, not less. Dr. Chen confirmed the dosages are appropriate. Combined with the isolation and the constant financial stress we're creating, he should be feeling overwhelmed enough to sign over control just to escape the pressure. And if he doesn't, then we proceed to Plan B, the competency evaluation. We have Dr. Morrison ready to testify that Dad's decision-making has been impaired since Mom died. With the right medical documentation, we can petition for conservatorship. That's extreme. So is waiting 20 more years for our inheritance, while Dad makes erratic decisions that diminish the estate value. We're not being cruel, Chris. We're being practical. He's clearly depressed. He's not thinking clearly. We're actually helping him by taking this burden off his shoulders. What about Grace, the housekeeper? She's here a lot. Does she suspect anything? She's just cleaning staff. She doesn't pay attention to anything beyond dust and dishes. Besides, even if she noticed something, who would believe her over us? The recording continued for another 12 minutes, detailing their strategy. Continue the medications, increase pressure about business problems, create situations where Richard felt overwhelmed and incapable, and ultimately force him to either sign over control or be deemed incompetent. It was a conspiracy, methodical, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Grace saved the recording to 3 separate devices. Then she called Richard. You need to hear something, and then you need to decide what you want to do about it. Richard listened to the recording in his library, his face draining of color as his children's voices described their plan to systematically break him down. When it finished, he sat in silence for 5 full minutes. Grace waited, giving him space to process. Finally, he spoke. They were willing to destroy me, to kill me, essentially. For money they'd eventually inherit anyway. They weren't willing to wait, and they convinced themselves they were helping you by taking away your autonomy. Victoria coordinated the medications. I remember her insisting on coming to doctor's appointments, saying she wanted to make sure I was getting proper care. I thought she was being a good daughter. She was being a strategic predator. Richard's hands shook with Rage and betrayal. What do I do? Call the police? Get a lawyer? Cut them off completely? Grace considered carefully. That's not my decision, but I'll tell you what I think. You could prosecute. What they did, coordinating medications to impair you, attempting to force conservatorship through fraud, that's probably illegal. Elder abuse at minimum, potentially attempted murder, given that their actions contributed to your suicide attempt. But criminal prosecution will destroy your family publicly and permanently. You'll never have a relationship with your grandchildren. Your legacy will be this scandal, not the empire you built. So I let them get away with it? I didn't say that. I said prosecution might not be the right justice. There are other ways to hold people accountable. Richard looked at her with something like hope. What do you suggest? I suggest you let them think they've won. Then you show them exactly what they've lost. Over the next week, Richard and Grace crafted a strategy that was both elegant and devastating. First, Richard called his 3 children and requested a family meeting on November 1st at the estate. The reason? I've done a lot of thinking since my hospitalization. You were right that I need help managing everything. I want to discuss transition plans. His children, hearing exactly what they wanted to hear, immediately agreed. Marcus booked a flight from San Francisco. Victoria cleared her calendar in New York. Christopher adjusted his schedule in Boston. They thought he was capitulating. They thought the pressure had finally worked. Second, Richard hired 3 attorneys, not his usual legal team, but specialists in estate law, elder abuse, and white-collar crime. He presented them with all the evidence, the medication records, the financial documents, the recorded conversation. They confirmed what Grace had suspected. His children had committed multiple crimes, including fraud, attempted conservatorship through false pretenses, and potentially elder abuse. But Richard didn't want criminal prosecution. He wanted something else. Third, Richard revised his will, legitimately this time, with independent counsel and psychiatric evaluation confirming his full competency. The new will was airtight, incontestable, and specifically designed to address what his children had attempted to do. And fourth, this was Grace's suggestion, Richard installed additional recording equipment in the library where the family meeting would occur. Not to entrap them legally, but to document their reactions when they discovered the truth. Let them show you who they really are when they think they've lost, Grace said. Then you'll know for certain whether there's anything worth salvaging. Marcus, Victoria, and Christopher arrived at the Ashford estate at 2 p.m. on November 1st. They'd coordinated their arrival, never a good sign, and walked in together with the practiced unity of people executing a plan. Richard greeted them in the library, looking frailer than when they'd last seen him. The medications had actually been discontinued weeks ago, but he played the part they expected. Tired, overwhelmed, ready to surrender. Grace was there too, introduced as someone who's been helping me organize my affairs. The children barely acknowledged her, just as Victoria had predicted on that recorded conversation. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice thin and shaky. "I've been struggling since your mother died. You've all tried to tell me that, and I wasn't listening. But after my hospitalization, I've had time to think clearly about what I need." Victoria leaned forward, barely concealing her eagerness. "Dad, we're just glad you're finally ready to accept help. We've been so worried. I know you have, and I appreciate that you've been thinking about my well-being and the future of Ashford Properties." Marcus pulled out a leather folder, the same living trust documents they'd been pressuring Richard to sign for months. "We brought the paperwork we discussed. Obviously, you'll want to review everything with your attorney. But the core structure is designed to take the operational burden off your shoulders while ensuring the business continues thriving. That's very thoughtful. Richard took the folder, but didn't open it. Before we get to that, I want to share something with you. Call it a moment of clarity I had while I was in the hospital. He looked at each of them in turn. I tried to kill myself on October 15th. Grace found me in the garage with the car running. If she hadn't arrived exactly when she did, I'd be dead. The children's reactions were telling. Victoria's face showed shock that seemed genuine. Perhaps she hadn't realized how close her plan had come to actually killing him. Marcus's expression was harder to read. Concern mixed with something that looked like calculation. Christopher actually paled, as if the reality of what they'd been doing had just become concrete. "Dad, we had no idea you were that depressed," Victoria said. "We knew you were struggling, but if we'd known it was that serious." "You would have what?" Richard's voice was suddenly stronger, clearer. "Stopped coordinating medications designed to make me feel hopeless? Stopped pressuring me to sign over control of my company? Stopped creating conditions where I felt so overwhelmed that death seemed like relief?" The room went silent. "I don't understand," Marcus said, but his voice suggested he understood perfectly. Richard pressed a button on the remote control in his hand. The recorded conversation from September 15th began playing through the library's sound system. His children listened to their own voices detailing the conspiracy, watched their plan laid bare, heard themselves describe Grace as too insignificant to notice their scheme. When the recording ended, Richard spoke into the devastating silence. "I want you to understand something. The person you plan to destroy, the father you were willing to drive to suicide for inheritance money you'd eventually get anyway, that person is gone. You killed him, not with carbon monoxide, but with betrayal." "Dad, we were trying to help," Victoria started. "Stop, I don't want to hear justifications. I've heard enough recordings of you justifying this to each other." Richard stood, suddenly looking stronger than he had in months. "Here's what's going to happen. I've already revised my will with independent counsel. I've been evaluated by 3 separate psychiatrists who confirm I'm completely competent. The will is uncontactable." He handed each of them a sealed envelope. "Your inheritance has been modified. You'll each receive $10 million in trust, enough to live comfortably but a fraction of what you expected. The rest of my estate, approximately $2.6 billion, will be distributed as follows." Richard looked at Grace, who stood silently in the corner, exactly as his children had expected her to remain. "Grace Mitchell, who saved my life and then helped me see the truth about what my own children were doing, will receive $500 million outright. An additional $500 million will fund a foundation in her name focused on supporting working-class families, elder care advocacy, and programs that help people like her who keep society functioning while being treated as invisible." The children's faces showed shock, rage, and calculation in rapid succession. "The remaining $1.6 billion will be placed in charitable trusts focused on causes your mother and I cared about. You'll have no control over any of it." "You can't do this," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "We'll contest it. We'll argue undue influence, mental incompetence." "You can try," Richard said calmly. "But I have documented proof of your conspiracy, recorded confessions of your intent to fraudulently obtain conservatorship, and testimony from multiple physicians confirming that you deliberately coordinated medications to impair my judgment. If you contest this will, I release all that evidence publicly and pursue criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted wrongful conservatorship. Your choice." Victoria was crying. Whether from remorse or fury was unclear. "How can you do this to your own children?" "I'm doing to my children exactly what they were willing to do to their father. I'm treating them like obstacles to be managed rather than people to be loved. The difference is, I'm leaving you enough to survive comfortably. You were willing to leave me nothing, not even my dignity." But Richard wasn't finished, because Grace had taught him something important. that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making people understand what they'd lost. "There's one more thing," Richard said. "I'm not cutting you out completely. You're my children, and despite everything, I can't erase that. So here's my offer. You each have 30 days to demonstrate genuine remorse and understanding of what you've done. If you can show me, through actions, not words, that you've recognized the harm you caused and are committed to becoming better people, I'll reconsider the inheritance distribution." "What kind of actions?" Christopher asked. "That's for you to figure out. Your mother would have known immediately what I needed to see. If you're truly her children, and not just actors performing concern, you'll know too." He looked at Grace. "Ms. Mitchell, I believe we're done here." Grace nodded. As she walked past the 3 Ashford children to leave with Richard, she made eye contact with Victoria, the woman who dismissed her as too insignificant to notice anything important. Grace didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence, her survival, her vindication said everything necessary. The month following the family meeting revealed everything about who the Ashford children really were. Marcus hired an attorney within 48 hours and began exploring options to contest the will, despite the evidence against him. His 30 days were spent on legal strategy, not self-reflection. Victoria tried a different approach: performative remorse. She called Richard repeatedly, sent emotional letters, showed up at the estate unannounced with apologies that felt rehearsed. But when Grace happened to overhear one of Victoria's phone calls to her lawyer, it was clear the remorse was strategic, not genuine. "I just need to convince him I've changed long enough to get back in the will." Christopher, the youngest, responded differently. He flew back to Connecticut and asked to meet with Grace, not Richard. They met at a coffee shop in Hartford, neutral ground. Christopher looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, "and I'm not here to manipulate you into convincing Dad to change his mind." "Then why are you here?" "Because you were right. About everything. We were so focused on the money, on what we felt entitled to, that we stopped seeing Dad as a person. We created a conspiracy to break him down, and I participated because I told myself we were helping him. But we weren't. We were helping ourselves." Grace sipped her coffee, waiting. "I wanted you to know that I've withdrawn from the family business entirely. I'm not pursuing any legal action, and I'm donating my $10 million inheritance to elder abuse prevention organizations. I don't want money I helped extort through psychological torture. Your father didn't require that. I know. I'm requiring it of myself, because if I keep that money, I'm still benefiting from what we did." Christopher looked directly at her. "I'm sorry for dismissing you, for underestimating you, and for being part of something monstrous. You saved my father's life and we tried to destroy it. I'm sorry." Grace studied him carefully. She'd spent decades reading people, and Christopher's remorse looked genuine, accompanied by the physical toll of someone who'd been confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. "Have you told your father this?" "I've tried. He won't see me." "Then write it down. Not a letter designed to get back in the will. A letter that acknowledges exactly what you did and why it was wrong. Make him understand you've genuinely reckoned with your actions. Then give him space to decide if he can forgive you." Christopher nodded. "Thank you for talking with me, and thank you for saving him. He's a good man. Better than his children deserved." After Christopher left, Grace called Richard and told him about the conversation. "Do you think he was sincere?" Richard asked. "I think he's trying to be. Whether he succeeds in becoming better is up to him. But he's the only one of your children who seems to understand that money isn't what he should be fighting for." While the Ashford family imploded, Grace was navigating her own transformation, one she'd never imagined possible. Richard had been serious about the $500 million bequest. He'd already established it in an irrevocable trust with Grace as the beneficiary, ensuring that even if he died suddenly, the money would be protected. Grace sat in the office of a wealth management firm that normally dealt with tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, listening to advisors explain what $500 million meant. After taxes, she'd net approximately $300 million. Even conservatively invested, that would generate $12 million in annual passive income. She would never work again unless she chose to. Her daughter's nursing school loans could be paid off, her grandchildren's education fully funded, generational wealth established. It was incomprehensible. "What do I do with this?" Grace asked the advisor. "Whatever you want. Travel, invest, donate, build businesses. The world is entirely open to you now." Grace thought about it for a week. Then she made decisions that surprised everyone except Richard. First, she kept working. Not because she needed the money, but because she'd spent 27 years building relationships with clients who depended on her. She gave proper notice, helped train replacements, and made sure everyone was taken care of before transitioning out. Second, she established the Grace Mitchell Foundation with $50 million in initial funding. The foundation's mission: supporting working-class families, providing resources for elder care, funding legal advocacy for elder abuse victims, and creating pathways for people like her, overlooked, underestimated, but deeply capable, to access opportunities. Third, she bought a modest house in Hartford, not a mansion, not anything ostentatious, but a real home with space for her daughter's family to visit comfortably. After 27 years of renting, she owned property. Fourth, she hired her daughter Emma away from her hospital nursing job to run the foundation's health initiatives at triple her previous salary. Mother and daughter became business partners, working together to build something that mattered. And fifth, this surprised her most, she maintained her friendship with Richard Ashford. "I still come to your estate on Tuesdays," Grace told him. "Not to clean. As your friend, is that acceptable?" Richard, who'd spent months being isolated and alone, felt something he hadn't felt since Patricia died. Genuine connection. More than acceptable. Essential. Despite Richard's warning, Marcus and Victoria did attempt to contest the will. Their legal team argued undue influence, that Grace had manipulated a vulnerable elderly man into changing his estate plan to benefit her disproportionately. The case went to court in March, 5 months after the family meeting. It lasted 3 days and ended in complete vindication for Richard and Grace. The evidence was overwhelming. Psychiatric evaluations from 3 independent doctors confirming Richard's complete mental competency. The recorded conversation proving his children's conspiracy. Medical records documenting the dangerous medication combinations Victoria had coordinated. Financial documents showing the pattern of pressure and manipulation. Richard's own testimony delivered with devastating clarity. The judge's ruling was unambiguous. The evidence shows a systematic campaign by the plaintiffs to undermine their father's autonomy, impair his judgment through fraudulent medical intervention, and obtain control of his assets through means that border on criminal. Their claim that Ms. Mitchell unduly influenced Mr. Ashford is not only unsupported by evidence, it's contradicted by the clear record that she saved his life and then helped him see the truth about his own children's manipulation. The will stands as written. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential elder abuse charges. Marcus and Victoria's legal challenge hadn't just failed. It had opened them to criminal prosecution. The district attorney, facing a high-profile case with clear evidence, did file charges: elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit wrongful conservatorship. The trial was scheduled for the following year. Christopher Ashford was not charged. Prosecutors determined that while he'd been aware of his siblings' plan, He'd been less actively involved in the medication coordination and had withdrawn from the conspiracy before the suicide attempt. More importantly, Christopher had genuinely changed. He'd written the letter Grace suggested, 12 pages detailing exactly what he'd done, why it was wrong, and what he was doing to become better. He donated his $10 million inheritance as promised. He entered therapy to understand how he'd justified participating in such harm. He cut contact with Marcus and Victoria entirely. 6 months after the family meeting, Richard agreed to see Christopher for the first time. They met at the estate, in the same library where the confrontation had occurred. Grace was there too, at Richard's request, both as witness and as someone Christopher had also wronged. "I don't expect forgiveness," Christopher began. "I don't expect to be restored in the will. I'm here because you're my father, and I want you to know that I'm ashamed of who I was and committed to becoming better." Richard listened as Christopher detailed his therapy, his understanding of how entitlement had corrupted his judgment, his recognition that he'd valued money over human dignity. "The person who participated in that conspiracy was morally bankrupt," Christopher said. "I'm trying to build something different. I've started working with elder advocacy organizations. I'm using my business experience to help them protect vulnerable adults from exactly the kind of abuse we inflicted on you. It's not redemption. I don't think I can be redeemed for what I did. But it's useful." Richard was quiet for a long time. "Then, your mother would have been devastated by what you all did. But she also believed people could change if they genuinely wanted to. Are you genuinely changing, or are you performing change?" "I'm trying to genuinely change. But I understand you might never know for certain. I understand I destroyed your trust, and trust isn't rebuilt with words. No, it's rebuilt with consistent action over time." Richard looked at his youngest child. "I'm not restoring your inheritance. That decision stands. But I'm willing to rebuild a relationship if you continue demonstrating that your change is real. It will take years, maybe decades. And I might not live long enough to fully trust you again, but I'm willing to try." Christopher's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." After Christopher left, Grace asked Richard, "Do you think he's really changed?" "I think he's trying. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than we were." Richard smiled sadly. "He's the only one of my children who understood that some things matter more than money. Maybe there's hope for him." The trial of Marcus and Victoria Ashford began in January 2025 and lasted 3 weeks. It became a media sensation. Wealthy siblings prosecuted for attempting to psychologically destroy their billionaire father to accelerate their inheritance. The prosecution's case was devastating. Richard testified about the systematic pressure, the medications that made him feel hopeless and incapable, the way his children had isolated him and undermined his confidence. Grace testified about finding the suicide note, saving Richard's life, and discovering the evidence of conspiracy. Medical experts testified about the dangerous medication combinations and how they would have affected Richard's mental state. The recorded conversation played for the jury, Marcus, Victoria, and Christopher's voices, detailing their plan to make Richard feel overwhelmed enough to sign over control. The defense tried to argue that the children were genuinely concerned about their father's mental health and that their actions, while perhaps misguided, came from love rather than greed. The jury didn't buy it. Marcus was convicted on all counts: elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Sentence: 4 years in prison plus $2 million in fines. Victoria was convicted on the same charges plus an additional count for coordinating the fraudulent medication scheme. Sentence: 6 years in prison plus $3 million in fines. Their appeals were denied. They served their full sentences. While the Ashford family tore itself apart in courts and prisons, The Grace Mitchell Foundation was building something transformative. With $50 million in funding and Grace's lifetime of understanding how systems failed working-class families, the foundation launched multiple initiatives, providing legal services, financial literacy programs, and advocacy for domestic workers, housekeepers, and other service professionals who kept society functioning but were often exploited and ignored. Funding legal representation for elderly adults facing abuse, exploitation, or wrongful conservatorship. Creating resources for detecting and preventing the kind of psychological manipulation the Ashford children had deployed. Funding education and training for adults who'd been locked out of opportunities due to poverty, lack of credentials, or family obligations. Emma ran this program, using her nursing background to create healthcare-focused pathways. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped 2,400 families, prevented 67 cases of elder financial abuse, and provided scholarships to 340 adults seeking career changes. Grace became a prominent advocate, speaking at conferences, testifying before state legislatures about elder abuse prevention, and using her platform to highlight the contributions and vulnerabilities of working-class Americans. She was profiled in the New York Times. From housekeeper to philanthropist, how Grace Mitchell became an unlikely champion for America's invisible workers. The article detailed her background, her intervention in Richard's suicide, her exposure of the Ashford conspiracy, and her decision to use her unexpected wealth to support people like her. One quote captured her philosophy. "I didn't save Richard Ashford's life to become rich. I did it because it was right. The money was Richard's choice, not my goal. But since I have it now, I'm using it to make sure other people don't have to be as lucky as I was to survive." Richard Ashford lived another 8 years after the suicide attempt. The experience had transformed him, not into someone who'd overcome grief for his late wife, but into someone who'd learned to live with grief while still finding purpose. He sold Ashford properties for $3.1 billion in 2027 and put the proceeds into charitable trusts focused on affordable housing, mental health services, and business opportunities for underserved communities. He spent his remaining years working closely with Grace on the foundation, using his business expertise to maximize impact, while she provided the moral compass and community connection. They became an unlikely partnership, the billionaire and the housekeeper, united by a suicide note that had saved one life and transformed two. Richard reconciled partially with Christopher, who spent those 8 years proving his change was genuine through consistent action and service. They never fully recovered the relationship they'd had before the conspiracy, but they built something honest in its place. Richard never spoke to Marcus or Victoria again. When they were released from prison, they attempted to contact him. He declined every overture. "Some betrayals are too fundamental," he told Grace. "They stopped seeing me as their father and started seeing me as an obstacle. I can't forget that, and I won't pretend to." Richard died peacefully in his sleep in January 2033, at age 75. His obituary mentioned his real estate empire and his charitable work, but the detail that went viral was simpler. He was saved from suicide by his housekeeper, who became his closest friend and partner in philanthropy. He left his remaining personal assets, approximately $200 million, split evenly between Christopher and the Grace Mitchell Foundation. The will included a note to Christopher. "You were the only one of my children who understood that earning back my respect mattered more than claiming your inheritance. Your mother would be proud of who you've become." In 2034, 10 years after finding the suicide note that changed everything, Grace Mitchell sat in her Hartford home with a journalist who was writing a book about the Ashford case. "Do you ever regret reading that note?" the journalist asked. "If you'd put it down, walked away, none of this would have happened to you." Grace thought about it carefully. "I'd still be cleaning houses for $800 a week. Richard would be dead. His children would have inherited billions, never facing consequences for what they did. The foundation wouldn't exist. The 10,000-plus people we've helped over the past decade wouldn't have gotten that help. So no regrets? I didn't say that. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a man's own children were willing to drive him to suicide for money. I regret that Richard lost 8 years with most of his family because they betrayed him. I regret that trust was destroyed in ways that can never be fully repaired. But you don't regret saving him? Never. Not for 1 second. What do you think Richard would want people to take away from this story? Grace smiled. Richard used to say that the most dangerous assumption rich people make is that the people who serve them aren't paying attention. We are. We see everything. The good, the bad, the ugly. And sometimes, we're the only ones who care enough to intervene when everything falls apart. Is there a lesson about wealth and family? Yes. Money doesn't just reveal character. It tests character. Richard's children failed that test catastrophically because they valued inheritance over integrity. Christopher eventually passed by, realizing some things matter more than money. And Richard passed by, choosing to use his wealth to support people like me, instead of preserving dynasty for children who'd betrayed him. What about you? How did wealth change you? Grace laughed. It didn't change me. It amplified me. I was always someone who noticed people and tried to help. Now, I just have more resources to do it. The core of who I am. That was built cleaning houses for 27 years, raising a daughter alone, learning to survive in a world that treated me as invisible. The money gave me a platform, but it didn't give me my values. The story of Grace Mitchell and Richard Ashford leaves several questions that resist simple answers. Can children who attempt to psychologically destroy their parent for inheritance money ever be fully forgiven? Should they be? Christopher spent 8 years proving his change was genuine. Was that enough to redeem participation in a conspiracy that almost killed his father? Was prison the right punishment for Marcus and Victoria? Or would forcing them to watch their father give away billions to causes and people they dismissed have been more effective justice? What obligations do billionaires have to their children versus society? Richard chose to leave his children minimal inheritances and direct his wealth toward charitable causes. Was that fair, or was it revenge disguised as philanthropy? Grace's entire intervention hinged on her being observant, being present, and being willing to act despite her position as just the housekeeper. How many other critical interventions don't happen because we dismiss the insights of people we've categorized as unimportant? Richard's suicide attempt was precipitated by both organic grief and manufactured hopelessness. How do we identify when someone's despair is being deliberately cultivated versus naturally occurring? And what obligations do witnesses have to intervene? 20 years after Grace found the suicide note, the Grace Mitchell Foundation had become one of the most effective charitable organizations in America, with $800 million in assets and programs in 40 states. Emma Mitchell, now 50 years old, had taken over as CEO when Grace retired at 72. The foundation continued expanding, always focused on the same core mission, seeing and supporting the people society had trained itself to overlook. Christopher Ashford, now 55, served on the foundation's board. He'd never remarried, never had children, and had spent 2 decades working in elder advocacy. He was widely respected in the field, not as Richard Ashford's son, but as someone who'd done the hard work of genuine transformation. Marcus and Victoria Ashford had faded into obscurity after their prison releases. Last anyone heard, Marcus was working in real estate in Arizona under a different name. Victoria had moved to Portugal. Neither had attempted to contact the foundation or Christopher. They'd gotten what they'd wanted, access to Richard's money, or at least the $10 million each, but they'd lost everything else. The Ashford estate had been converted into a retreat center for elderly adults, recovering from abuse or exploitation, a decision Grace and Richard had made together before his death. Hundreds of people each year spent time in the mansion that had almost been Richard's tomb, receiving support, resources, and the message that their lives mattered. In the library where Richard had written his suicide note, and where Grace had confronted his children with the truth, there was now a small plaque. In this room, Grace Mitchell saved Richard Ashford's life by refusing to look away. May we all have the courage to see what others miss and the compassion to act when it matters most. The story wasn't a simple redemption narrative. It was messier than that, full of complicated grief, partial reconciliations, and questions that resisted easy answers. But it proved something important, that worth isn't determined by wealth or status, that the people we dismiss as invisible often see us more clearly than we see ourselves, and that sometimes refusing to look away from someone else's pain is the most revolutionary act possible. Grace Mitchell had been a housekeeper who noticed everything. In noticing, she'd saved a life. In saving a life, she'd exposed a conspiracy. In exposing a conspiracy, she'd transformed her own life and the lives of thousands of others. The note that Richard had written as a goodbye became, through Grace's intervention, an invitation to something better, a reminder that we're all one honest witness away from being truly seen. And sometimes, being truly seen is what saves us,